Packing the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, before election 2020, bring up that phrase, and we'd all pretty much think of the FDR administration and the New Deal programs. But once again, in 2020 America, we are hearing some progressives call very loudly to add seats to the United States Supreme Court. Brenée Goforth is with the John Locke Foundation. She wrote a fascinating column recently for CarolinaJournal.com about the history of packing the court. She joins us now. Brenée, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
In the piece you wrote at CarolinaJournal.com, you call packing the court an underhanded practice. Why?
So court packing has been used even back when it was originally, kind of brought out in the FDR administration. It was used to get things passed that you wanted passed, right? So if you can get it through the legislature and then you can get it signed by the president, then the only thing that's standing in your way of being able to keep that law long term is the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court is meant to decide whether things are constitutional or unconstitutional, not whether they like them or not, right? This measure would fill the court with essentially yes men for progressive legislation so that they wouldn't face any real true judicial review, which would be an issue because instead of deciding whether or not things are constitutional or not, they would create a facade of legal review that would allow for essentially any legislation that they put out to just go unchecked, which
essentially that's what FDR tried to do during the New Deal era.
Absolutely. And so that's obviously an issue because the buck has to stop somewhere. And if it can't stop at the Supreme Court, where is it going to stop?
We've been hearing more and more about this pretty much in relation to the fact that President Trump had 3 appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court during his first term. And tell us a little bit more about some of the calls today and what's going on and why.
Right. So after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed and Justice Amy Coney Barrett was appointed, that renewed calls for court packing because many people saw the court as too conservative now that it has this 6-3, conservative lean or whatever you'd like to call it. And so people don't like that because they're worried that it's going to sway the country in a certain direction or maintain some sort of conservative status quo. But the reality is that these justices are all people who are highly commendable, highly respectable, and whose job, once again, is not to legislate from the bench, but is to decide whether things are constitutional or unconstitutional. And so once we saw the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, it renewed calls for, court packing to be able to what people would say is balance the court, but appears to be a measure to protect any sort of legislation that they currently don't think they can get through with a constitutional determination.
It brings up all sorts of questions about the checks on power and the separation of the branches. And I think your point's a good one about people who are thinking, well, if I can't get it done at the legislative level, here's my chance at the judicial level if I can just get the, quote, right people to be sitting on the court. And we'll just add seats until we get the ones we want.
Absolutely. And under FDR, it would have been as many as 15. So it's a lot that people are, willing to do to get the court to have a particular makeup.
You mentioned the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Evidently, she made some comments about this issue.
Yes, she did. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not a fan of court packing because the Supreme Court is supposed to be an apolitical institution. It's supposed to really just decide constitutional or unconstitutional. And she said that if anything would make the court look partisan, it would be court packing, some legislature, leaning one way and then deciding to fill the court with justices of their particular lean. And that says something because a lot of people have been saying that, we should listen to what Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to say before she passed to, give us guidance on what to do with the Supreme Court now. And it seems like, if anything, she would be very against this measure.
Interesting, because she was a well-known progressive, and yet it is people who are like-minded today who are now calling for the very thing that she warned against. So one of those ironies that we're seeing. One of the things I really thought was so interesting about the piece she wrote for CarolinaJournal.com is that you looked back at the FDR era and looked for some historical references here in North Carolina. What was the commentary like in North Carolina when this was going on?
Yes. So North Carolina has been traditionally more of a conservative state. So even when FDR went back and proposed it, even though he had large amounts of public support, we got quite a bit of criticism on court packing. And you could see nationwide quite a bit of criticism. Political cartoons would depict FDR as a ventriloquist and all of these, potential appointees to the Supreme Court as wooden puppets. And people were very skeptical then, as well as we'd hope they would be now, of packing the court with as many justices as you can get in your favor. Right. And so one of the things that one of the commentaries in North Carolina newspapers said was Mr. Roosevelt's court packing initiative did greater violence to trust in American institutions than anything other than the Civil War.
Oh,
which it's very strong. It's a very bold statement,
right.
But it tells you just how much people really opposed this measure and the threat it could do to public trust in our institutions.
Brenée, when I look at what happened during the FDR era and fast forward to today, and it seems like we are so off track. Now, you are of a younger generation than I am. I'd be interested in your perspective on this. It feels like we've reached a point now where when someone is nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court or even another federal bench, we now don't seem to agree on what it means to be qualified to actually be a judge. Right. Where do we go as a country when we can't even agree on that?
It's very true. I mean, these things, court appointments back, way back, were not these political things. They were people who were well respected being appointed to a bench because they were good at what they do, and they're qualified in that they know the law, they know the Constitution. As time has passed, they have gotten increasingly more political, and it seems now that when you speak about Supreme Court justice appointments in particular, but even other court appointments, it really is a measure of politics. And, presidents will say that they've done a wonderful job if they can get as many, justices on the bench as possible. It's unfortunate that it seems that we can't separate politics from this process because it really is meant to be an apolitical one. And if we want to, again, sustain trust in our institutions, then we're really going to need to depoliticize this process once again.
There was a time, of course, when folks who were nominated to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court would be approved by wide margins. Mm-hmm. And now it just seems to be whoever is in control of the U.S. Senate. And we have these battles going on in these public hearings. And it's not a good place to be.
No, not at all.